Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason, published in 1961, is a landmark work by the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault. This book is an exploration of how Western society has perceived, treated, and institutionalized those deemed mad over the centuries, particularly focusing on the transition from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment and the modern era. Foucault's analysis challenges traditional narratives about the history of psychiatry and mental illness, emphasizing the social, cultural, and political factors that have shaped the concept of madness. Foucault's methodology and approach. Foucault employs a historical methodology that he refers to as archaeology of knowledge. Rather than tracing the development of ideas through a linear, progressive narrative, Foucault seeks to uncover the underlying structures of thought that govern how societies perceive and categorize knowledge. In Madness and Civilization, he is particularly interested in the discontinuities and ruptures in the history of madness, those moments when society's understanding of insanity shifts in fundamental ways. Foucault's approach is critical of the traditional historiography that sees the history of psychiatry as a story of progress, where the treatment of the mentally ill steadily improves over time. Instead, Foucault argues that the history of madness is a history of exclusion, control, and power. He is less interested in the medicalization of madness as a scientific progress and more focused on how the concept of madness is constructed by society, often to serve specific social and political ends. Madness in the Renaissance. Foucault begins his exploration in the Renaissance, a period he describes as having a more ambiguous relationship with madness compared to later centuries. In this era, madness was often associated with knowledge and insight, albeit in a manner that was seen as detached from reason. The madman could be viewed as someone who possessed a unique understanding of the world, or as a figure embodying the mysterious, the poetic, or the dangerous. Art and literature from the Renaissance period often depicted madness as part of the human condition, something intertwined with creativity, genius, and the divine. During this time, however, the seeds of exclusion were already being sown. Foucault discusses the phenomenon of the ship of fools, where the mad were literally cast out to sea, symbolizing society's desire to physically separate the insane from the rational world. While there was no systematic confinement of the mad during the Renaissance, there was a growing tendency to view them as other, as beings who needed to be kept apart from the rest of society. The Great Confinement. A significant portion of Madness and Civilization is dedicated to what Foucault terms the Great Confinement, a period in the 17th century when the European states began to systematically confine large numbers of people deemed socially undesirable, including the mad, the poor, the unemployed, and the criminal. Foucault argues that this was not merely a humanitarian effort to care for the insane, but rather a reflection of broader social and economic changes. The rise of capitalism and the corresponding need for a disciplined, productive workforce meant that those who could not contribute to the economy, whether due to mental illness, poverty, or idleness, were increasingly viewed as problems to be managed and controlled. The mad were swept up in this broader effort to regulate and discipline society, and were confined in large institutions alongside other marginalized groups. Foucault's analysis of the Great Confinement challenges the idea that the development of psychiatric institutions was primarily a medical or scientific endeavor. Instead, he presents it as a form of social control, where the aim was not to cure the insane but to remove them from society and impose order. The mad were no longer seen as figures of fascination or insight, but as threats to the social order who needed to be isolated and controlled. The birth of the asylum. Foucault traces the origins of the modern asylum to the 18th century, a period marked by the Enlightenment and its emphasis on reason, rationality, and progress. During this time, the treatment of madness began to shift from confinement to what was seen as a more therapeutic approach. The mad were no longer simply locked away, they were placed in asylums, where the goal was to restore them to reason. However, Foucault is deeply critical of this new approach, which he argues is just as much about control and power as the Great Confinement. The asylum, in Foucault's view, is not a place of healing, but a mechanism of discipline. The treatments administered in these institutions, such as moral therapy, which emphasized work, order, and obedience, were less about curing the individual and more about enforcing societal norms and values. Foucault also examines the role of the physician in the asylum, who emerges as a figure of authority and power. The physician, armed with the tools of reason and science, has the ability to define who is mad and who is not, and to dictate the course of treatment. This power dynamic, Foucault argues, reflects broader social structures where knowledge is intertwined with power. The physician's authority in the asylum mirrors the authority of the state and other institutions in society, where knowledge is used as a means of control, madness, reason, and power. A central theme in Madness and Civilization is the relationship between madness and reason. Foucault argues that the modern concept of reason is defined in opposition to madness. Reason is what is rational, ordered, and logical, while madness is what is irrational, chaotic, and dangerous. This binary opposition serves to reinforce the power structures in society, where those who are deemed rational hold power and authority, while those who are deemed mad are marginalized and excluded. Foucault's analysis challenges the notion that reason is an objective, universal standard. Instead, he sees reason as a socially constructed concept that is used to justify the exclusion and control of those who do not conform to societal norms. The history of madness, in this view, is not just a history of psychiatry, but a history of how societies define and enforce their norms and values. Foucault also explores how the concept of madness has been used to silence dissent and suppress alternative forms of knowledge. Throughout history, those who challenged the dominant order, whether through political, religious, or intellectual means, were often labeled as mad. By defining dissent as madness, those in power could dismiss and discredit it, thus maintaining their authority. The legacy of Madness and Civilization. Madness and Civilization has had a profound impact on the fields of history, philosophy, sociology, and psychology. Foucault's work has inspired a critical re-examination of the history of psychiatry, challenging the narrative of progress and humanitarianism that has often dominated the field. His analysis of the relationship between knowledge and power has also had a lasting influence on the study of institutions and social structures more broadly. Critics of Foucault have pointed out that his account of the history of madness is often more concerned with ideas and discourses than with the lived experiences of the mad themselves. Some have also argued that Foucault's emphasis on power and control downplays the genuine efforts of reformers and physicians who sought to improve the treatment of the mentally ill. However, even his critics acknowledge the significance of Madness and Civilization as a work that has reshaped our understanding of the history of psychiatry and the social construction of madness. Madness and Civilization remains a seminal work in the study of the history of psychiatry and the social construction of mental illness. Foucault's analysis challenges traditional narratives about the treatment of the mentally ill, emphasizing the role of power, exclusion, and control in shaping the concept of madness. By examining the historical relationship between madness and reason, Foucault reveals the ways in which society constructs and enforces its norms and values, often at the expense of those who are deemed different or dangerous. Despite its controversies, Madness and Civilization continues to be a foundational text for anyone interested in the history of mental illness, the philosophy of knowledge, and the dynamics of power in society.